Thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for coming here as well. So, obviously, my name is Corey Brotherson, and I have been, as you just said, I have been a professional writer for over 22 years because I am a very, very old man. I have done everything from fiction to social media work to journalism and pitching to a major Hollywood studio. But obviously, if you are here today, you want to hear me specifically talk about video game writing and narrative. So right now, I'm writing for an adventure video game called Windrush Tales, which is based on the real-world arrival of Caribbean immigrants into the UK during the 1950s, of which my parents and grandparents were part of. And for nearly 3 years, I was the lead narrative designer for the most recently announced Tales of Kenzera Zao by Surgent Studios, which will be finally launching in April. So glad to be able to talk about that. It's been 3 years of being under NDA and not being able to talk about anything about it, so I'm very, very happy that's out now. So today I'm going to tell you how to get into, well, basically go on your own journey into narrative design and do what I do, because believe me, as strange as it may seem to some of you, you can write your own video game pretty much as soon as you go home tonight. But to get you there, I'm going to have to tell you about my journey of how I got here. And strangely enough, it starts with this guy. Or, more accurately, this version of Spider-Man. So, yeah, this is me when I was about 5 years old, and it was about 1984. Didn't have great costumes back then, so please do not judge me on this photo. So, 5-year-old me loved lots of different things. He loved comic books, reading, video games, books, Spider-Man. But back then, writing in video games wasn't really seen as something as particularly important. So it was often handled by members of the typically small development team. But as I got older and video games began to progress, writing and narrative design became a little bit more important to the entire industry in itself. And I slowly realized that my dream of writing Spider-Man didn't have to be restricted to just comic books or movies or TV, but it also could be video games as well. But back then, there really wasn't a clear path to becoming a games writer. So this is around the 1990s now. So I focused on one of my other passions, which was video game journalism. So I did a degree in the English language and literature. And then just to be sure, I ended up doing a master's in journalism, which then got me a placement as a games journalist, which turned into my first full-time job in the games industry. From there, I worked for Yahoo and then freelanced for a couple years for companies like EA and Eurogamer, while doing short stories and basically working on my own fiction comic books as well. Eventually, I was hired by PlayStation to become a content and copywriter, which got me an inside look into how it was to make video games, which led me right back to Spider-Man. During my 12 years at PlayStation, I worked on hundreds of games, but one of my biggest moments for me was when I was brought full circle and I worked with the developers on Spider-Man on PlayStation 4, resulting in my name being in the credits. But while I wrote about the game and worked with Marvel for it, I didn't actually get to write any of the game's dialogue or the story or anything to do specifically with that craft. So I used my time at PlayStation to learn more about video game narrative, interviewing writers, creative directors, and trying to understand the process of what it is to actually write a game itself. And when I left PlayStation, I started work on Windrush Tales and then managed to move on to Surgent Studios. And it was then I realized just how much work goes into writing modern video games. So it may seem super obvious, but it's very worth stressing. Writing video games is very different to writing TV, film, comic books, or a novel. Yes, my job involves creating interesting characters, engaging storylines, and unique worlds that the games exist in, like you would with pretty much any other story. But ultimately, these elements have to work within unison with the gameplay as much as possible. And with that comes the understanding that games writing isn't just about writing. For example, how can you realize the characters within the budget and restrictions that you have? How can you convey parts of your story through the environment for the artist to show on screen when the player isn't paying too much attention to the text, which a lot of the time they don't necessarily do? And how well do you do the story and characters and work them with the gameplay itself as well? Sometimes your story itself won't fit within the specifically parts of the games designed precisely to make it fun or play better. So understanding the decisions and designers that have actually made is pretty much key, because sometimes you have to edit your writing to make it work with the gameplay as best as possible. Another part of your job may be about understanding and predicting what the player is probably going to do in the game, what they'll find fun, and when actually rewarding their curiosity afterwards. For example, in the most recent Zelda games, which you've probably played, Nintendo knew that the players were likely going to try and attack or even just bump into the other NPCs in the game. So dozens and dozens of those characters react specifically, or even say a bit of dialogue, to something that you've kind of in reaction to what you're doing itself, which is a relatively small thing, but in the world it makes it feel everything is more alive in that respect, and it rewards the player by having the characters react to their actions in very, very small ways. And that's something that you, as a writer or a narrative designer, may have to think about. Which brings me to the most important part of this talk, yourselves. If you do want to become a games writer or a narrative designer, there are a few ways which can help you down that path. The first tip is really to analyze the games that you play. Given that you're here, you might already be doing this, but it's basically about understanding the games. Ask yourself, why was the game written or designed in that specific way? And look at the creative choices that the developers have made. What makes the game fun or interesting? Conversely, what makes the game boring or particularly bad to play? The more questions that you ask about the game's constructions, rather than just being swept up in the actual gameplay itself, the better you are be understanding it. Secondly, study writing and understand that not every single part of writing is going to be enjoyable. Again, this may sound a little bit obvious, but knowing how to create character arcs, plot lines, succinct dialogue, and all the skills that are vital to the role basically as a foundation for being a writer. Even if you don't think that your writing is particularly good, just keep going at it because you will eventually get better at it. And on top of that, games writing can often involve having to write lots of different things which aren't necessarily progressing the story. So you really need to be able to enjoy it. We had a demo of Windrush Tales playing at the British Library on Adventure X earlier this year. And on the surface of it, it may seem like it was a fairly straightforward demo. But what you're seeing on screen at this moment in time is just a very, very small example of what we had to create it. So this is a branching dialogue tree, where the player will have to make multiple options and be able to ask different things of the characters in front of them that they're talking to. And some of those options will open up bits of dialogue or sometimes different endings, meaning that the characters may like you or dislike you a little bit more based on what you've said to them. This also means that some players will probably never see certain parts of the dialogue twice unless they replay the game. I have to stress, what you're seeing here at the moment is actually only half of the demo that we did, and it's not the actual dialogue itself, it's just the directions of what we're putting the player through. So the demo itself was probably only about 10 minutes long, but this ended up being around about 10,000 words of work in itself. And that's something that was probably going to take you less than 10 minutes to actually go to play through. So make sure that you genuinely like writing, even when it gets difficult and long, because this is a massive, massive undertaking, and you're going to have to do a lot of it. Tip 3. Obviously, if you're here at university already, you've probably got to know parts of this, but if you're not, you don't have to specifically study narrative design if you want to become a games writer or narrative designer. It can help, though. Narrative design courses didn't exist back in my time, back when the dinosaurs were roaming the earth. But those days, there are a lot more relevant courses that you can actually take that can get you actually the basics to understand the craft itself and the techniques that you need to be able to get a job inside the industry. These are a few of the books that I currently use as well that kind of help me develop and refine my skills. There are also lots of video channels as well on YouTube which can be really, really useful to you. So maybe just kind of have a look at a couple of these as well, Game Maker's Toolkit and GDC, which kind of help you understand how games are made on a broader detail, but also going to go back to the first point that I said about analysing games themselves. They're very, very useful for that sort of thing. So my next tip is probably the most important practical one, and the one that some of you may be already doing, which is, basically making games in itself. Big caveat here, do not make it a big game. Make it as small as possible that you can to actually enjoy the experience. Games take a long time to make, hence the grey hairs in my beard right now. Creating a game does allow you to understand the decisions being made and that you have to make as a writer and a narrative designer, and potentially working with or as an artist, musician, or other craft as well. You can download programs like Ink, which is what we use for Windrush Tales, or things like Twine, or even buy something like RPG Maker or even Dreams on PS4 as well. all of which ways that can help you make your own game and give you valuable experience. Because that's going to be the key, really, for studios. They want you to have a little bit of experience that shows that you understand how it is to actually make a game. A lot of them will probably ask for a portfolio as well. But having examples of your writing within the games itself is really, really important. Sometimes a course that you're on will actually ask you to create a game. So that can be quite useful as well if you have the ability to do a qualification in that. So this is probably the most cliche tip, but it is just as important as the others. Do not give up. So to get to where I am now, I've had to take many, many rejections from lots of different companies, even as recently as a couple of years ago. And I got made redundant from my job last year. Sometimes I still think my writing isn't good enough, and I still suffer from imposter syndrome. It's okay to feel that way if you do feel that way, but just know that you won't feel that way forever. And if you do have a passion for writing and games, you will be able to do this if you keep at it. The main thing is to understand that lots of people will feel how you feel during those down moments, but every step that you take, even the tiny ones or the ones which feel like setbacks, is another step towards you fulfilling your dream. And sometimes that doesn't mean going down the path that you had planned, but even the most unexpected diversions can help. Because at the end of the day, I've still not been asked to write Spider-Man. But if a 5-year-old boy from Birmingham, dressed up as Spider-Man, jumping on his parents' couch with his slippers on, can be here talking to you about this and his experience, and still be closer than he's ever possibly been to fulfilling that dream, then really anything is possible. Thank you very much for your time.